Monday seminar. Let me welcome the Hajič Jr. And I think we are moving today further from the topics we talked about in the previous sessions, which were mostly morphology, I think, so linguistic. But I think that musicology in our surrounding is not too far from our interests. When I say surrounding, I mean not only language, but also faculty of mathematics, physics, which is known for being enthusiastic in music. So it fits well to the university milieu. So Honza, start, please.
Hello, everyone. Hello also to people who are not in the room, but are watching via Zoom. I had the good fortune to spend the last few years working at the Masaryk Institute and Archive, which is a humanities institute through and through, at a musicological project that worked with Czech medieval liturgical music. And I had the role of the in-house digital humanist, which I never really did before, but I hope to continue doing after. And I thought that maybe this is a space which is interesting for people at UFAL to some extent. The institute has historically been at this, boundary between linguistics and computer science. It does make sense, I think, to talk about this because I think there is significant potential in collaborating collaborating with musicologists and musicians and putting our expertise into this weird little niche scientific market that nevertheless I think you will find could be interesting. I have to also say that I'm not really a musicologist, so the insights that I bring from this are really the perspective of a computer scientist who worked in this space for a while. So if there are any musicologists in the audience, I apologize in advance for misrepresenting your field, but this is how I see it, and this is how you might also perceive it if you get there, and hopefully my experience might help get a better idea of what you're getting into. So what is digital musicology? Is it like using computers to aid musicology? Well, not, I mean, if you type your paper in Word, it's not really digital musicology, is it? A better definition might be, or in general for digital humanities, using computers to answer previously unanswerable questions. So that's where using the digital domain adds some value perhaps, but really nobody knows what digital musicology is. It's a good idea to look at rather what it does and get some idea from the bottom up. So one of the things it does is this kind of digital access. You have a source, which is somehow interesting. All my examples will, or most of my examples will come from the domain which I worked on, which is medieval liturgical music. That's what I know. So you can have a digital edition in which the added value is that you have a clear idea of what's on the page. You can search it. This is hard to do with a physical copy, unless you know Latin and unless you can like read this. Or you can build databases in the Chant scholarship. We have this Cantus Index thing, which has more than 500,000 records about Gregorian chant. If you encode more complicated music, you can do more complicated things with it. This is from the so-called Josquin project. Josquin was a really famous composer at the end of the 15th century, basically the Renaissance composer. So people at Stanford have been encoding his music. into a digital format, and then once you do this, and once you do this for a lot of music, you can start analyzing the whole corpus. This is something that's kind of familiar to linguists, right? Once you annotate a bunch of stuff, then you get interesting things about how language works at scale. So this is interesting insights into how Josquin's music works at scale. You can also use a database like this to really find things that you couldn't find before, because nobody just saw the 2 pages, each of which live in a different library, in a different city, in a different country. And it turns out that, for instance, in this case, a really famous Alcadelt piece is kind of a liturgical one, is identical to some madrigal. Nobody noticed this before. It popped up as a really suspiciously high similarity when somebody built a database and put in even a relatively weak OMR system to recognize like what's on the page. Still, something useful popped out. So this also is digital musicology, this kind of discovery of stuff that you haven't been able to discover before. It's of course not just for early music. There is a digital Mozart edition, which tries to put out really all of the music by Mozart in digital encoding. All of music by Mozart is, it sounds kind of superfluous because, of course, Mozart editions have been coming out one after the other. The problem is that a lot of the musicology around what is Mozart and what isn't is kind of unclear outside of like the really famous stuff, the operas and the piano works, etc. There is a bunch of stuff where like we don't really have a very good idea of whether it even is Mozart, what's the history of the piece, etc. So there's still stuff to do even on the famous people. It's not just digital editions. This is a project that compares what can be gleaned from text sources about the musical life of pianists versus violinists. It's hard to see, but in here you have examples like what kind of jobs they had, whether they were just musicians, maybe they had other jobs as well. And there is a little bit, it's difficult to see, but this portion says how many violinists worked also as pianists and how many pianists were also violinists down here. So this kind of projects about musical culture, not just the musical works, this also exists. And this is also in some cases, I would say, even more interesting than studying the works using digital tools again. Overall, I think we could, or I think I can group or structure digital musicology kind of along this axis that goes from digital access tools. So already before computers, you were really limited in what you could research by your physical access to the sources. You cannot do research on Czech liturgy if you are an American researcher in the 70s, because you cannot come here and you cannot look at the sources. So already digitization helps quite a lot with that. Then you go further, you add editorial information, you can group things into databases, and then this is kind of the digital access part of digital musicology, to provide this material to more researchers, to more eyes, to more ears. And then you can hop over this. It's not an exact line, but then you can start actually doing digital research. So this is like the strong definition from before. You ask research questions that you cannot really answer without using digital tools. Typically, this is a matter of scale. So I call this quantitative research. But don't take this term too seriously. And you can, of course, do much more afterwards. You can, I don't know, there are projects that simulate the acoustics of destroyed spaces, or spaces that no longer exist, cathedrals that were rebuilt in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, but there is music that was written maybe specifically for a certain architecture. This is the case actually with the earliest polyphonic music from Notre Dame in Paris. the polyphonic pieces were supposed to be sung from a specific place in the cathedral, which no longer exists, but somebody did their dissertation in collaboration with audio engineers, and they tried recreating the acoustic, and they figured out things that, like, this music was sung at certain feasts, and at these feasts some banners would be unfurled in the church, which changed the acoustic properties, which suddenly it started making sense. Like, yes, you could actually hear what's going on in all the voices, because like, the acoustics of the space changed. So there's a lot of fascinating opportunities also in this like purple part, but also it's the Wild West. It's like there is no structure that I can discern like beyond the orange part. So these things roughly build on top of each other. So I will try to quickly go through each of these categories in this order. Digitization itself. As like I said, we push information into the digital domain. The step one for this is just to scan it, right? Or there can be other media types, but mostly digital humanities works with documents on paper or parchment, and to work with this, you have to scan it. There is the IIIF standard for sharing images that doesn't go against copyright regulations under which most libraries operate. These are not the same copyright regulations as like the law on copyright, but this is a weird world of what libraries are allowed to share and how. For instance, for many Czech libraries, they're regulated by some internal regulations of the Ministry of Culture that doesn't let them share OCR results, for instance. Like it's weird, but IIIF goes around most of these restrictions. So IIIF is important. There are already quite extensive digital archives, both of individual libraries, and there is the Europeana thing, which tries to centralize access to many of these individual sources of digital data. Step two is extracting computer readable information. OCR, obviously, I tried to do this for music for a few years here. It's still not working too well, but we hope in a new project that we can actually make it work for early manuscripts too. But so this is all about pushing information into the digital domain, making it available, making it searchable, making it possible for researchers to find material. This is mostly done at what's called memory institutions, so libraries, museums, archives, the people who hold the actual source material. Next, you have the digitized source, but the source itself is kind of cryptic. It's hard to understand usually. The older it is, the worse. So you need some editor to make it comprehensible. This is what editions basically do. They bring source material to a contemporary audience or to some segment of the audience, to experts, usually in case of critical edition. Critical editions are like the bread and butter of much of what's going on in digital musicology. Do you know what a critical edition is? Maybe not everybody does. So it's hard to say what exactly is a work. A single work, let's say a musical composition, survives maybe in 10 bucks. A famous piece, the Chromatic Fantasia and Fugue, survives in 16 different manuscripts, right? They are not all the same. For instance, the first ones don't have the fugue. So the fugue is only there in some manuscripts from 1730s. So now, but at the same time, it's clear that these are versions of a single piece. So now if I go to the harpsichord, which one do I play? What is the work, right? So a critical edition, making critical edition means working with all the sources of a work and somehow making the editorial decisions, like which is more important, which is less important, what is the same, what is different. For instance, in this case, I played this from a critical edition, and there is the clearest sign that you're working with music that a musicologist has edited is footnotes. footnotes plus sigla in the footnotes. It's always a good sign that somebody who knew what they were doing was working with it. These are specific markers of like exactly which source from which library some information is based on. You get variants because sometimes it's really hard to reconcile different versions of the source. Historically, critical editions were done for recovering the original, especially for medieval and antiquity myths, like the original version of Homer's Odyssey, the original version of the Arthurian cycle of the English legends and of the Knights of the Round Table. This is where the critical edition workflow first came up. And since then, it has been quite successful as a method. And this is now happening in the digital space. Because in the digital space, it frees you up from all kinds of restrictions of paper editions. We'll get to that. There are other kinds of editions like diplomatic, where you just use a single source and you present the source as is. You might try maybe to fix some mistakes in terms of there is a blob, but you know what the word is. So you may add like in place of this blob, there is supposed to be those two letters so that the word is this, but you don't really go beyond that. And then there are practical editions where you already determine what purpose is this edition going to be used for. And you edit down the breadth of information from your sources just to serve this purpose. Whereas the critical editions try to do their best to present the source material and the work from the source material and leave how you use it to you. So a practical performance edition, for instance, would do away with all those remarks and just say, play this, right? And you don't get variants. The editor would decide, nah, this sounds better. I won't put this one in. So digital editions typically require two things: encoding the content of the sources. You have the picture, but you don't really know what's in the picture. You have OCR results, but for instance, you want to know, like, this is a name, this is a place, this is a year. So you have somehow to encode that. You can try named entity recognition, but I mean, good luck with inquisitorial reports from the 13th century. The choice of encoding is absolutely critical. There are open standards here that do get used. For music, there are some plain text format. There are XML-based formats. Then sometimes you need to encode geographical information. So there is some subsets of the GIS system. And the other thing that happens with a digital edition is presentation, how you show the information that you encoded. And the separation between these two is something that is extremely critical and crucial for the digital editions. Digital editions give you this split, right? What you encode and how you show it is independent. If you are doing a paper edition, then you have very limited opportunities like to encode something and then not show it. It's like you never encoded it in the first place. And also you just have, you know, this amount of paper, this amount of pages, and you have to somehow fit it in there. So digital editions, there's a reason why digital editions are really kind of the rage these days. This is an example of the digital edition that we did for the Jestevnice Cancionál. So the Joscan project is what you can do with a digital edition and how your presentation and content is really decoupled. You cannot really do this in a paper edition of Joscan's music, especially like if you want to, I don't know, let the user of this select just music from his first half of creative life and second half and look at how these statistics are different. Like you cannot really give your readers this kind of flexibility with a paper edition. You can do really fun stuff. This is a digital edition of a 15th century medical student's book. Somebody was making notes. like on how to diagnose patients based on the color of their urine piss. This was a really important method because in the 15th century, like you had to use all the outputs that are available to you because you don't really have magnetic resonance. And one opportunity, like how to present what is just letters on a page, is to try doing it as if you had a web app. Like if a medieval doctor could open their laptop and they had a sample and they would look like, which color is this? And then you could click on the color and it will say, huh, your patient's dead. That's the case of this one. But already in this, there is a level of interpretation, right? We only have the names of the colors. And so choosing the color code is an editorial decision. For this one, this was a project that happened in 2 days in 2015 at a workshop. So here, not much research went into the decision on which colors to use. But if you wanted to do this seriously, then you would have to go into like, how did people in the 15th century perceive colors? What could these names mean? I did not choose the medieval Inquisition example randomly too. This is also an existing project. It's like a Wikipedia for inquisitors. It's also this kind of, it's a critical edition that you have an encoding of the source material. You present it in ways that are faithful to the source material. But at the same time, you use the digital space to add this functional layer, right? So like if I was an inquisitor today, I got all these reports. How would I want to read them? How would I want them presented to me? You would build a wiki. Maybe, I don't know. So there are some major advantages to digital editions as opposed to paper editions. First of all, even more important than the presentation flexibility is interoperability. So the stuff that you do, if you make the right technological choices, people can link to your digital edition and use this information that you spend a lot of money to encode directly for their research, leverage it, cite you, etc., etc. This is on us, though. We have to tell the humanities people which technologies to use. We have to implement the REST APIs, etc., etc. But this is a really major advantage to doing editions digitally. You have a lot more impact, essentially, or you can have a lot more impact than if you just put something out on paper. Like I said, the flexible interfaces are great, and the interactivity is also a great new way and really like born digital way of presenting the sources. I don't know, make a sing-along app for the medieval chant book, right? It's a different way of connecting to the sources. And I think there is real opportunity here to bridge the distance, the cultural distance between today and the source material and the material that humanities are often researching. This is a huge PR opportunity for them and for us because we can get paid to do this. Okay. You can do practically anything, but you have to do it on a budget. So you still have to make a lot of editorial decisions, especially about what not to encode, like what is not really relevant for the research questions that you are asking. This is difficult. This is something that the humanists typically have to decide. And our role is to say what existing software they can use, so how can they save on software development costs so that more can be encoded. This is an important discussion always when a digital edition is being made, not only in our project, but we talked with many people who had the same basic dilemma, like what do we throw away because we cannot afford to do it for the sake of a nicer presentation of what we do encode and better interoperability. Fine, moving on from digital editions, we go to databases. This is basically the quintessential distant reading resources, and distant reading is an important term for digital humanities. It's kind of where digital humanities started. Some say it's not as clear, it's never as clear, but let me just give a brief introduction to what distant reading is. So this guy Franco Moretti who was a literary scientist, was kind of unhappy with how literary science was looking. And he published in 2000 this argument that literary science is just focusing on a very detailed reading and rereading and rereading of a small canon of books. And that these are substantially biased also towards Western European literature. He published this in something called the New Left Review. It was political to some extent, but also like it's hard to do literary science apolitically. So it was a relevant part of the discussion, and he proposed that maybe we should sacrifice this depth and detail for the sake of broadening our scope to study more literature from across the world. He worked with this idea of world literature, so that literary science should not be siloed into those national schools. And I'm not sure how much impact this had on like the core literary science, but it definitely had a huge impact in terms of digital humanities, because it turns out that this kind of distant reading idea, not specifically in how he meant it, but in general, that we throw away some level of details and gain a lot of opportunities to compare vastly different things. This took off, and computers are built for this, right? So it's out of comparative literature, this quickly evolved into basically computational methods in humanities. And while critical editions mostly belong still to like the close reading part, not entirely, but often they do come out of this set of assumptions about what is important and what we should be doing. Databases are like quintessentially connected to distant reading and this sacrifice of specificity for comparability across a broad range of material. So, like I said, we have a database of Gregorian chant. There is more than, I think now it's more than 600,000 records even. It's been built over the last 20 years or so. There is a lot of sub-databases popping up across Europe. We have 2 in the Czech Republic, but one is really tiny. But this already enables research about Gregorian chant that was really not imaginable before this database was built. We have a database built in Brno at the Faculty of Arts of bohemical sources, of like Czech sources that were created in Bohemia, of sources of religious songs, not of liturgical chant, not of Gregorian chant, but of songs that were also vastly more popular and sung across many people. So there is a lot of sources for this, and they scanned the major sources, they encoded the beginnings of melodies, they transcribed the texts, and there is now a database in which you can track quite accurately, like when did each song start being sung and when did it fall out of favor. You can look at the confessional differences. For instance, the Protestants and Catholics, or it wasn't even Protestants in the 15th century, it was basically Utrechists, the post-Hussites, may have used a different repertoire than the Catholics, or maybe they use the same song, but they use a slightly different version of the text that emphasize certain differences in like the religious dogmas that they were operating under. So this is a good resource for studying that segment of culture. Again, without a database that tells you like this song occurs in source 1, 2, 3, 15, 18, 21, 22, 25. Without this kind of database, you would be lost. You would spend years on figuring out the simple things. The quintessential musicological database is RISM. It aims to be a database like of all the musical sources, all the sources that have music in them. They have sections on musical iconography. They have sections on literature about music. It's a huge international project. I'm not sure how many records they have, but it's in the many millions. Also, they recently had to rebuild their search interface because of digital decay, basically. We'll get to that later. Overall, databases are what enables comparisons across these vast amounts of repertoire, what basically helps you listen faster, right? It's not really humanly possible to listen to all those songs, but you can just narrow down your search to what's interesting to you, and this helps. They are really the key research for quantitative research. I think here that much is obvious. They are a key resource for other people's research. If you are building a database and if you are doing sufficient quality control, you are doing a huge service to the field. Also, it's hard to get funding for this. So you are doing a huge and rare service for the field. If you are doing insufficient quality control, you are doing a huge disservice to the field. That's a topic for a different part of the presentation. Fine. Building databases, it's much harder than building critical digital editions, but also it has yet greater impact. Careful garbage in, garbage out. So next up, this quantitative research segment. Once we have a database, once we have all the information encoded, maybe now we can ask some exciting new research questions. So instead of asking like if something is true, you can ask to what extent is this hypothesis true, and this is quite important because if you look into humanities papers, you always find a lot of qualifiers, right? So this is true at this time, in this area, for these people, for this segment. You rarely ever read something that would really talk about how Charles University worked in the 1400s. You find information about how a specific college worked, how a specific, let's say, I don't know, how the doctors, how the medical students worked, but it's hard to get anything more general, right? With this, you sort of can, if you can convince people that like they don't really have to have results that are 100% true for a very small segment. They can be fine with results that mostly hold for a broader range. Again, data is key. Standardization is extremely important. If you are working on a digital humanities project, time that you spend looking for standards that other people have already used is well spent. Don't reinvent wheels. There are way too many wheels. Some of them are really clunky, but some of the standards that have been in use for a longer time are really well designed. And if you don't understand why they are designed in a certain way, it's a good idea to spend some time figuring it out instead of rolling your own. It will not be better. This is, I got burnt by this. Also, it's a good idea to get involved. It's really boring, but get involved in committees that do this. If there is a standard that's like almost good enough for you, for the purpose that you need some kind of extension. Instead of doing it on the side, it's worth it to go talk to the people who actually maintain the standard, because otherwise in a few years, the work you did will be hopelessly lost. An example of this kind of quantitative research, again, in plain Chant, that's what I'm aware of, is, so once we have encoded some source material in a machine readable format, in this case, this is the Volpiano encoding, this is GABC. You can see the GABC format is quite a bit richer. Volpiano just records like the clef and the pitches. GABC records extra stuff, like maybe there is a pause here. So this is a richer encoding. Like if you are encoding huge amounts of chants, then you likely use this. If you are trying to retain more information about a smaller amount of chants, you can use this one. The transfer from here to here is unambiguous. From here to here, you cannot really go. Okay, so the authors took an existing database of chants encoded in these ways. They built the required software tools to be able to analyze this. They wisely chose to implement this within a larger library. So Music21 is the Python library for computational musicology. They implemented a module for that. And they were able to show something. So there is this generic hypothesis in musicology, or like in cognitive musicology, maybe it can be said, that melodies tend to work like arches. So in general, melodies tend to first go up and then go down. And this has to some extent or another been observed across many different genres, many different cultures. And it's something that is in the background as a kind of generic, one of the few things that you can say about music in general without putting in this hundreds of qualifiers. One thing you can say about music in general is that melodies tend to go in arches. So in this paper, the authors looked at whether this is also the case in Gregorian chant, right? So the first one, yeah, that's kind of an arch, right? On first sight. The second one, is it maybe? I don't know, not so much. So they had a hypothesis that yes, music is, the Gregorian melodies are arches. They did the work to extract the right features from the data sets. And they said, yeah, it looks like melodies look like arches. They used a smart baseline, which is for saying what is a phrase which goes in an arch. They use this GABC encoding, which includes information that you can use to say this is a musical phrase that makes sense, which is exactly those breath marks. In Volpiano, you don't really get that, so they could only use a part of their data set, but this data set was sufficient to show this. So phrases are delimited by breath marks because it makes sense, right? The points where you breathe is where you have to stop singing. So a phrase stops there necessarily, and another one starts afterwards. And the baseline they used, the gray lines, is they randomly selected segments of melodies from which are not phrases, like this. And this goes to show that, you know, really phrases are arches. Sensible musical units, melodical units tend to behave in this expected way. And they did this on 3,000 antiphons, 1,000 responsories, almost 1,000 introits. So on very large amounts of data. If somebody was looking at this by hand, it would take much longer than one conference cycle. This was a workshop paper at DLFM, Digital Libraries for Musicology in 2020. So this, I think, goes on to show that when you have a good research question and when you have the data resources, then you can do very powerful stuff with digital research. But it has these prerequisites. That's why I put it down here. It has, like, you have to have the digitized material, encode it well, curate a database, and then you can do this. And then, like I said, there is much more you can do, but it's kind of out there. It's hard to systematize. So it's like, if you're interested, you can just Google stuff. Specifically, how this integrates, I can show on the Jestemnice Cancionale network, which is what I was doing for this Old Myths, New Facts musicological project that aimed to reinterpret especially Hussite sources without like Hussitism, as you are, I suppose, well aware, was a politicized topic. So the interpretation of sources, and specifically musical sources, since they were specifically the Jestemnice Cancionale was rediscovered in 1870s or so, was a political subject. It was never really free of assumptions about what it should contain, right? It should be this Czechness and the national identity manifested by these songs, which are. How many of you have heard of the Jestemnice Cancionale? Right. And how many of you are heard that the important part of the Jestemnice Cancionale are the songs, like Tož sú boží bojovníci and Povstaň, povstaň, veliké město pražské. Right, that's the idea, right? The songs are a small part of the repertoire in there. The vast majority of what's in there are Czech translations of Latin Catholic Gregorian chant. It's the value of this source is that it's the earliest vernacular liturgy with music. At least I think it's the oldest vernacular liturgy overall. Like the parts that should be in every Catholic mass and that were always said in Latin in the Middle Ages because that was like the language of the church, have been in the Eastern Musicology translated to Czech, and great care was taken to maintain the melodies exactly as they were for Latin. One of the fun parts about the Cancionale is figuring out like which translation choices were made in order to fit the music and which musical choices were made in order to fit a translation. So anyway, it's an important source, right? There is ongoing work on a critical edition of this. 2 volumes have already been published. One for the mass repertory, one for the songs. That was quite recent. That was in 2019, I think. Finally, like all the songs that are the famous part, but not really the most important part of the Cancionale, they got published as a book with critical notes and with comparisons to other repertoire, etc. in 2019. And the idea was that really the paper edition is insufficient for the amount of work that should go into a critical edition of this source. So let's try and do a digital edition, or at least a methodology. And that's what I was working on a pilot digital edition of a very small part of the Cancionale, of a part that that's for Christmas liturgy. This really is interdisciplinary work. What I was doing is a very small part. I was just doing like the web development component of this, let's say. This is what a page from the Christmas Vespers looks like. So yeah, there is a nice picture. The picture is a letter. I think that's kind of obvious. So how would you use this? If you get this, okay, so here is music, here is text. So you sing the music with the text, right? Then there is some text, so you read it. Then there is more music, so we'll sing it. And so, not exactly. So first of all, you have to know what the function of these parts is. Because paper was precious, parchment was even more precious, and you wouldn't write down anything that you didn't have to. So all the stuff that was obvious to people of the time would not get written down. For instance, you sing this part, you do something with this part, and then you sing this part again. That's how it would properly be used, right? But you don't write it because you know that you are going to sing the same part again. So it would just take up space and ink and would be useless. Also, you don't read this part, you sing this part, but you sing it to a melody that everybody who would be ever singing it knew by heart. So there is no need to write out the melody. There is a hint, though, because you could use one of 8 different melodies to sing this text. And the hint is here, it's the blue part. It's called a differentia, and this tells you, like, okay, the following text you should sing using a melody that ends like this. This is not immediately obvious, right? So an addition of this should somehow make this obvious, tell you that this belongs together even, that this is integrated into one, functionally into one entity. And how to sing this, etc., etc. This text is divided into verses, right? Every red letter is the next verse. The letters are red because you would alternate who is singing which verse. So in order to know where you skip to, it's a good idea to have the letter in red so you can see it, because the lighting is not that great, right? This was sung in the evening. You would have a few candles, but also candles were expensive. This is the only pretty picture in the entire manuscript. Maybe there was a plan to make it a bit larger, but the plan was abandoned. So this manuscript does not come from a very rich place. Presumably they wouldn't have too many candles, or they would be careful with how many candles they are spending. So you really need, the red letters and making it very clear so that you can read it. Anyway, moving on. One part of the edition is to make this available, to make it readable, to make it comprehensible, like what we are looking at. And because this is a source that gets sometimes still taught about in high school, it should be presented in a way that's accessible to high school people. So no long introductions. They have to see something and it has to be clickable. And then you figure out what it is. That's the digital facsimile. Also, like I think the aspect of discovering something mysterious and finding non-trivial things about something is fun and it's engaging. And I think you all were paying more attention to this part, explaining the stuff, than you were paying for the entire presentation so far. But this is how it works. It's fascinating material, but the presentation is important. And aside from the digital facsimile and making this fun for high schoolers and people from computer science, it's also important to connect this work to the broader Chant databases. So we have to make sure that this antiphon, this piece of singing, gets the correct general ID so that you can compare it to different versions in different Latin sources, for instance, in the same or different geographical areas, etc., etc. And for this comparing, there aren't so many tools available. The Chant people have built a beautiful database, but they don't have so many analytical tools. So aside from the digital facsimile, it's pretty interface. It's also an interface that allows encoding it directly. I didn't build it. I took something that existed, but then I extended it. And that's where I made a mistake in selecting the data standards. But anyway, aside from the digital facsimile, which is also the encoding interface, we catalogize this. We make sure that it's compatible with the broader Chant database environment. And yeah, the Canvas ID is the link. And also I poached some bioinformatics in order to make a pretty analytical interface. Because if you want to compare the melodies and say, okay, maybe there is something specifically Czech about this source, then you have to see, okay, but how Czech is it? Is it really specific? How does it compare to, how does this, it's not the same antiphon, but how does this antiphon compare to other melodies for it? Does it really have the same text? Are there text variations which are specific to Bohemia? And for this kind of work, you need to align the chants. And for aligning multiple sequences, there are multiple sequence alignments algorithms. So by the way, this is unexpectedly leveraging the software project from master's studies here. We did a bioinformatics project, and 10 years later, it's relevant again. So this kind of interface already shows you some more things that you can work on. For instance, differentiate are really encoded badly, inconsistently. It's the blue part, right? This one. So some people say it's part of the antiphon because it's part of the whole complex, and they encode it there because it's written in the source. It's right there. Some people say, no, this is not part of the antiphon. This is part of how you sing the psalm afterwards. So it should not be encoded in the same melody, right? Also, you don't really sing it this way. You don't get here and then sing that. So maybe this encoding is misleading. So this is something that immediately jumps out if you just align the melodies. Another thing, a bit more exciting than just fixing inconsistencies in the database. So maybe there is a tendency with younger and younger sources to fill in this interval in the melody. So you go from G to D, you go first lower at this syllable UDA at the A, but this is the oldest source, and there is the fourth is you just jump. In two younger sources, you fill it in a little, and in the youngest source, you fill it all in. And question, does this show a trend? I haven't done this yet, so I don't know, but somebody can do it. And this kind of question can be done using this ecosystem. Also, why is this one so weird? this is a completely different melody, right? It doesn't start the same way. It doesn't continue the same way. So maybe there are at least two different melodic traditions for this antiphon. How did they get there? Gregorian chant is supposed to be consistent across the entire church. Apparently it's not. So again, interesting tidbits that jump out of doing some visualization, basically. Again, this requires an interdisciplinary approach. That's why I got some funding from the Cultural Evolution Society, of all places. To study this, we work together with a postdoc from Durham University Anthropology Department who knows the methods, like how to say this is relevant, this is noise, etc. It's quite interesting. In the last few minutes, I try to draw some generalizations and about the pitfalls I ran into. Again, like it's just one person's attempt to draw generalizations, but maybe because most of you share the same perspective, a computer scientist now thinking about digital musicology, because I've been talking about it for the last 15 minutes. So from this perspective, what are some of the traps that you can fall into? By the way, this is wrong. This is archaeology says that mammoths were not hunted in pits. But anyway, point one, data is kind of rare. And the fact that you have a lot of data in one place doesn't really mean that it's a data set that you can use, right? All of it is a data set you can use, right? Cultural phenomena don't exactly repeat most of the time, are the ones for which we have sources. Data sets are usually not collected in order to be representative of broader cultural areas. They are collected piecemeal for specific questions. So in the case of the Chant data set, somebody was researching mass repertoire in the oldest sources from St. Gallen from the 10th and 11th centuries, where they start having notation, and then they transcribed these books. So it looks like you have 10,000 chants, for instance, but it's 5 times 2,000 chants from 5 sources from the same place and roughly the same time. It doesn't tell you much about what was going on elsewhere. It's interesting, but it's not. You see where the problems start. The volume of data doesn't necessarily correlate with how representative it is about some broader topic. Also, this goes hand in hand with the fact that we are in the humanities. And here the objective, as opposed to engineering, which computer science is kind of engineering, right? We tend to work with good enough systems. Good enough today tends to mean passes the Turing test, so you cannot tell if a human wrote it or ChatGPT wrote it, for instance. Or a translation that is good enough, or I don't know, image classifier that reliably tells that there are dogs and cats in your pictures, or who is in the picture, who is trying to break in my factory. But in humanities, the objective is the actual knowledge, not the system, not solving a task, but figuring out like one thing, the next thing, the next thing. A database collected in the humanities does not follow the same assumptions as data sets collected for machine learning tasks tend to do. Library doesn't mean data set. Libraries, even if they digitize everything, it's still broken up into sub-collections of sub-collections. We have a project with the Moravian State Library now for optical music recognition. We had a meeting and like already we just asked how many pages of music they have. And the answer took more than an hour to really figure out like where they are, what kind of music, how to get them. You have to be very, very careful. Just because there is an X amount of data doesn't mean it's usable as a data set of X samples. Also, by the way, if you go into digital humanities, you have to learn how to read sigla, these identifiers of sources. Otherwise, it's next to impossible to read anything and discuss anything. But it's easy. It's just you have to know that this exists. I didn't. For instance, for this chant evolution research, right? I want to have a sample of about 1,000 melodies, and they should be divided so that I have 20 melodies from 50 different sources. And the 50 sources should cover, let's say, the 5 centuries of manuscript Gregorian chant culture, which is 11 through 16, before the printing press, after music notation was invented. And I want sources from the major geographical areas in Europe. I want something from France, I want something from Germany, from Italy, from the East, which is us and Poland, maybe something from Spain and England. So, and I want this kind of coverage, and I want the same 20 antiphons in each of those 50 sources. There is a, let's say, this should be achievable, because Gregorian chant is structured in a way that you should know for every day of the year, for every part of liturgy in the day, which chant you're supposed to use. There is a prescription for that. Nowadays, there are apps for that. As you might suspect, this did not turn out to be so easy. I started out with 250,000 antiphon records. They're by far the most represented genre of plain chant in the Cantus Index database. So like getting 1,000 out of 250,000 shouldn't be too hard, right? It doesn't sound hard. It didn't sound hard to me. Okay, I need to transcribe those melodies. So already only 100,000 instances are left, but it's still like 1,600 different antiphons, out of which I need to select 20, which are distributed in 178 sources, out of which I need 50 that have those 20 antiphons. It still sounds, at least to me, it sounded manageable. By the way, there is an MP complete problem hidden in this. If you have a table which says like this chant occurs in this source, and you want to select the maximal submatrix which only contains once, which only contains as it does occur. This turned out to be the maximum by-click problem, which ChatGPT almost got right when I asked it, but not entirely. It turns out that you don't really need an MP. A solution for this, a greedy approach, might work well enough. But if I ask for 20 antiphons, I got 79 sources, which did contain the same 20 antiphons. Okay, so far, so good. We're barely there, but we are there. 20 of these are from the same city. That's kind of useless. 9 others are from a different city in the same geographical area. Again, it's kind of useless. So we're effectively down to some maybe 60 sources. At least they do come from different centuries, so they're not entirely useless. I still have to figure out if they cover those 5 centuries and the whole area of Europe sufficiently. I'm thinking that they won't. Also, not all 20 of these antiphons are really useful. Some are really short. And also, not all the sources will necessarily have the full melody written out. Sometimes for famous antiphons that everybody knows by heart, you only get the first few notes to remind you, oh, it's this one. It goes back to saving parchment. But I need the whole melodies transcribed. And maybe they memorize a slightly different version than in their neighboring city. So this would also be useless. So maybe there will be 50 sources, maybe not. We will see. But out of 250,000 records, it turns out this is a surprisingly difficult problem, right? From the general data set, which is in fact a bunch of smaller data sets that use the same standard, to get something for your research question is not so easy. This is a major pitfall, I think. Point 2, anytime you generalize in order to do some research like this on a broad database, you lose detail. And the humanities people are very reluctant to lose details. And sometimes and often this is very warranted, because this goes back to they're trying to find out the truth and not a good enough approximation. It's a cultural thing, but it's with good reason, right? Because if you write a paper, then you want it to be true. And if somebody reviews the paper and says, this isn't exactly true, this is too broad of a statement, then yeah, your paper gets rejected. And like, you may have done interesting work, but the field doesn't work that way. Also note that in this spirit, my experience might not generalize to yours if you go in here. And also, in order to even formulate a good research question, it takes some time and it takes some depth. And the same goes for understanding the research questions that the humanities people have and want you to help with, maybe. It took me 3 years of sitting in weekly meetings with musicologists before I was able to even formulate this research question properly. Like, what do I really need? What kind of data do I really need to understand what's going on to figure out something useful? Point 3, the publication cycle in humanities is quite a bit different. The trend is larger publications, fewer of them. Co-authorship isn't really very common because the field tends to be sparse. There are fewer researchers than areas to work on, as opposed to, I don't know, computer vision, which for some time was coalesced and everybody was hacking away at percentage points on ImageNet or MSCOCO or something. So the opposite is the case here. There's a lot of material and you have to figure out like which material gives you something that's interesting enough and new enough to get published. And it's not so often that two people work on something closely related so that it makes sense for them to work as co-authors. Musicology is especially bad with this. Also, it has this kind of subculture of like the individual genius. There could be more co-authors. The standard for including someone, the bar for including someone could be much less stringent and it would still be fair, I think. But then again, you know how we put co-authors on papers, write data sets with like 60 co-authors, out of which 50 were doing some small subset of annotations. I mean, why not? But we are kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. The material is finite. So once you publish a paper about something, it takes a lot of new material to clear the bar for publishing something new about the same material. So the choice of material is critical. If you're studying something and somebody else is also studying it, chances are, if they are first, that you can just really scrap whatever you were doing, because there is really like you would have to spend like the next project on this material to get something new. So the choice of material is people are very careful about that, and people are careful about sharing some sensitive parts of their work before it's really published. But also there are not too many specifically digital humanities publication venues. Conferences in humanities don't count as publications. There is usually no peer review. So you have to go to journals, and there aren't so many for digital humanities that would be valuable in terms of bibliometrics. So this is something that if you're going to do some digital humanities work, getting publications out of it is not easy. It's good to be in a position like I was when no publications are really required. And also, if you're working with a database and if you want to publish something on top of that, you really have to go into how quality control was performed on that database, because you can report untrue things afterwards, and nobody likes that, and retractions hurt. I think a part of these issues can be resolved if musicology kind of adapts its mindset to accepting, okay, with this group of methods, we can get results that are of a different nature than what we're used to. It's not necessarily like the truth about this part of material. It's approximately true about a lot of material, and you can start using this insight to inform other research. But there isn't too much openness to, or I haven't seen it yet. Point 4, digital decay. Nobody is going to really work on the same thing that you worked on. Nobody's going to maintain it. So in order for your digital work to be valuable, you should use technologies that don't need a lot of maintenance. This is a mistake that I made as well, because because we had this front end requirement for high schoolers that it should be colorful and fun, etc. piece of software that we went with lives in this area. It's based on Angular, so it's JavaScript framework, and I've already had to upgrade the major version of that like 4 or 5 times in a few years in order to stay to pay off the technological debt of working on something from 2017 and having it deployed and available to today's browsers. And then like in the middle of 2021, again, it crashed because the Angular version was out of date with some Firefox security features, whatever. You had to be very careful about this. And now that the project has stopped paying me, I'm really not sure who is going to maintain it. So you have to pay attention to how quickly the technologies that you use or you recommend for other people to use go out of date. Point 5. Fortunately, there is already quite a decent ecosystem for digital humanities work, especially the XML-based technology stack. If you can use it, use the text encoding initiative formats, music encoding initiative formats, and if they are too complicated, then you can start maybe thinking about using a simplification. But still, like it's a good baseline to start with. There are many Python libraries for small subproblems. For music, the situation is paradoxically really good because of this propensity of people who do computer science being also people who actively make music and hence being interested in musical topics, and some of them get funded, so some of them develop software. The Music 21 library is pretty amazing, and it's in Python and it's maintained at MIT. It's a good piece of software. And quite general, and it really helps with many different musicological needs because it was developed, again, it's getting developed for many years. Visualization libraries are also important to get a hang of. Visualization matters. You can have digital humanities work that is basically built around getting a picture like this, right? Or a dashboard or something. The fact that you can generate this kind of high-level insight into confusing data is really valuable. And then the humanities people can take this and run off of it and get new ideas for which details to work out, like what's interesting about this, right? This is a visualization of the interactions of Thomas Jefferson with various groups of people. Do you see those very strong links? Those are his slaves. So apparently, in some sense, there were more interactions between Thomas Jefferson and his slaves than between Thomas Jefferson and his family members. I don't know what it means, but the visualization tells you something interesting to work off of, right? And there are choices involved, which are more for graphic designers than for programmers. Like, I don't know, my Chant analysis comparison software needs a distance matrix, and it should be red for chants that are distant and green for chants that are not. But like figuring out where the transition is, where it starts being where some level of similarity starts being interesting and should be visually appealing to in order to draw the attention of an expert to that point, took some time to figure out and took a few consultations. And it's like one parameter. Also, have you read Mr. and Marketka? Who has read Bulgakov's book? What's wrong with this graph? Any ideas? Who is bezdomný? Bezprizorný in the Czech translation. Exactly. Yeah. So those pairs are the same people. There's Fagot up there. This is Korolev. Don't let this be you. Consult subject matters experts early on. I'm not sure if this is really a mistake. I just looked for illustrations of why visualizations are pretty, found some gallery of digital humanities visualizations, and then I was looking at the picture and I was thinking, wait a second, like, why is bezdomný so non-prominent? And then you see Eva, and then you see So this is I didn't find this on purpose. This kind of jumped out yesterday, but it leads very well into my final point. Subject matter experts, the humanities know a lot more than we ever will about the material. We have to consult with them early on, keep consulting, make sure that you understand what they need. They are not very good at explaining their assumptions. This is something you have to draw out a little bit. But we have to be careful not to create more problems than we solve. And these are the problems with like misleading visualizations, for instance, or stuff that's hard to maintain. Encoding data in ways that isn't really interoperable, on which it's hard to build the next project, right? This is not so easy. But still, there are a lot of opportunities. In this Expro grant, like the digital humanities part is 1/2 full-time equivalent on a grant which has more, I think 4 or 4.5 FTE. And the digital part usually gets about the same amount of comments as everything else. So there is interest, and I think this is judged by international panels still, even the interim reports, not just the first one, right? And really, there are huge amounts of digitized materials, like the first step on the pipeline. Libraries were very diligent in this, but it's so much material that there aren't really enough researchers in the world to cover it all without digital methods, and there are huge gaps in what has already been worked on. So there is a lot of material to work on. There are opportunities here. Remember just that library doesn't mean data set. Okay, so digital humanities can be pretty exciting. It's after like 10 years of doing computer science and machine learning, it's quite interesting to learn something about something completely unrelated and be able to bring in your expertise to at least a little bit to help move things along and make them more interesting for other people. It's not low-hanging fruit. It feels like low-hanging fruit. Sometimes it is, but it turns out it's different work than hacking away at models. If you can get like one thing to work, it's great. The reward structure is different, but it's still exciting. If you don't want to be very deep in the like model architectures and in the math part, but already like figuring out the math for saying, do really melodies of plain chant evolve from leaps to filled in melodic sequences? This already takes quite a bit of non-trivial statistics to tease out. So it's not as flashy technically, but it's still interesting. You have to be very careful about the choice of material. And this is something that we are really unable to work out on our own. This is something that needs those experts who spend their lifetime studying the material. The material provides finite research opportunities. It's not a data set on which you can hack it all the way up to 99.99 and still try and make it better. Like once you find out something, once you describe something, you're done, you have to move on. There is a lot of penetration into humanities already. Like there are digital humanities courses in King Salman University in Jordan, in Amman, Jordan, right? I think the faculties of arts in the Czech Republic are somewhat behind the curve here, and musicology as a field is also behind the curve overall compared to where, especially literary science and everybody who's working with text is. But basically, if you want to do something a little different, and if you find the position and funding, etc., go ahead and do it. It's fun. It's worth it, and also it's worth touching upon these aspects of like scientific as opposed to engineering progress. it gave me a lot of respect for those publication issues that humanities people face, which are not so much of a problem for us when our conferences give out are peer reviewed and every year you can submit something new. This is not the case in all fields. Well, anyway, I hope this was interesting for you. And if you have any questions, here too.
Yeah, thank you very much.